There are moments in life when a single confession can shake the walls of certainty. On a cold afternoon at Harvard University, Professor Elias Hawthorne stood before a packed auditorium of scholars and students. For decades, he had been a celebrated linguist, a man whose words shaped how the world thought about language and power. But that day his voice trembled. For years, he began, I taught that English belongs to the West. I once said that in the Philippines, people don't speak real English. The room fell silent. Cameras clicked. His students looked up in disbelief. And then, with a deep breath that seemed to carry the weight of an entire career, he said, I was wrong. He spoke of his journey to Manila, of children debating Shakespeare with passion, of vendors switching languages effortlessly, of prayers whispered in English that carried the heartbeat of a nation. The most living English, he said, is not found in Harvard or Oxford. It's found in Manila, Cebu, Davao, where words are used to survive, to connect, to hope. The audience didn't move. Some watched with awe, others with quiet respect. Outside, snow fell softly against the tall windows of Harvard Yard, while inside, something far more profound was melting, the arrogance of a man who had once believed he owned a language. That was the day Professor Hawthorne's story began to be rewritten. But to understand why he stood there, humbled and transformed, we have to go back to the moment when his pride was still intact and his blindness complete. Months before that day at Harvard, Elias Hawthorne stood beneath the golden lights of a conference hall in Geneva. It was one of those international gatherings where scholars wore their reputations like armor, voices polished, egos quiet but immense. He was in his element. The world saw him as a leading authority on global linguistics, a man whose theories about the purity of English were quoted in journals and textbooks alike. When a journalist casually asked about the rise of English in the Philippines, Hawthorne smiled almost indulgently. It's widespread, he said, swirling his glass of wine. Functional, yes, but not real English. Laughter rippled across the room. The statement, though small, carried the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. To him, English was a fortress built by the West. Its grammar, its accent, its elegance safeguarded by tradition. He had spent decades teaching that mastery of English meant mastery of Western thought. Anything beyond that was imitation. He didn't realize that arrogance, dressed as scholarship, had become his second skin. Later that evening, a colleague approached him. You've been invited to lecture in Manila, she said. They're eager to hear your views on global education. He nodded, amused by the idea. A fine chance, he replied, to show how English should truly sound. As he looked out from his hotel window that night, the lights of Geneva shimmered across the lake, perfect and controlled, just like the world he believed in. He had no idea that thousands of miles away, a very different kind of English was waiting to dismantle everything he thought he knew. The plane descended through a haze of tropical sunlight, and for the first time in years, Professor Hawthorne felt out of place. Manila stretched beneath him, vast, unpredictable, alive. As he stepped outside, the heat hit like a wave. The air was thick with car horns, street vendors, laughter, and a language that sounded like English but breathed in rhythm with something else entirely. His taxi driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, chatted effortlessly in English. He joked about traffic, politics, even Shakespeare. Hawthorne gave polite nods, though a quiet irritation stirred inside him. Impressive, he thought, but still, not quite right. At the hotel, the receptionist switched between English, Tagalog, and Japanese as she greeted guests. The waiter at breakfast used English to recommend dishes, his tone confident, unhesitating. Hawthorne observed, analyzing every word as if to find proof of imperfection. Yet each encounter only left him more unsettled. That afternoon, he wandered through Intramuros, the old walled city. In a small cafe, university students debated philosophy, quoting Camus and translating him fluently into English. Their rhythm, their humor, it was sharp, alive, unapologetic. Hawthorne watched, his mind caught between admiration and denial. Later at Divisoria Market, chaos reigned, colors, noise, energy. A young vendor bargained with a foreign tourist in English, shifting tones like a performer. When the deal closed, she laughed, saying, "That's how you win in life. Speak with confidence." Her words echoed in him. At sunset, Hawthorne found himself before a small church. Inside, voices rose in prayer, English words carried by faith rather than form. "Our Father," they began, and something in his chest tightened. That night, on the hotel balcony overlooking the city, he whispered the same question 3 times, each quieter than the last. "Could I have been wrong?" The traffic hummed below, like an endless heartbeat. For the first time, doubt crept into the fortress of his certainty. 2 days later, the grand ballroom of a Manila hotel buzzed with anticipation. Flags from dozens of nations framed the stage, and the air carried a quiet expectancy. Professor Hawthorne adjusted his tie, scanning his notes, his lecture titled "English as the Language of Global Precision." It was the same presentation he had delivered in London, Berlin, and New York, always to applause. He assumed today would be no different. When he began to speak, his tone was calm, confident, rehearsed. "Filipino English," he said, "is widely spoken, but let's be honest, it lacks the authenticity of native English." The room fell silent. No murmurs, no polite laughter. Just silence, heavy and complete. He hesitated, glancing at the audience. Teachers, journalists, students, faces unreadable but alert. Then from the middle rows, a woman stood up. Her voice was steady. "Professor, I teach at a public school in Quezon City. My students use English to talk to the world, to dream beyond poverty. If that's not real, then what is?" The words cut through the room like glass. Before Hawthorne could respond, a student, barely 20, raised his hand. "Sir, what makes English real? The accent or the ideas it carries?" Hawthorne froze. His well-rehearsed argument unraveled in his mind. He looked at their faces, earnest, proud, unashamed. These weren't imitators, they were innovators. Each question struck deeper than criticism. It was a mirror. He closed his laptop slowly. "Perhaps," he said after a long pause, "I came here to teach, but I see now I'm here to learn." Applause broke out, not the perfunctory kind that follows a speech, but the kind that comes from recognition, respect without resentment. For the first time, Hawthorne felt the walls of his certainty begin to fall. In that moment, humility didn't feel like defeat. It felt like freedom. The morning after the conference, Hawthorne was invited to visit a public school on the outskirts of Manila. The drive took him through narrow streets lined with small homes, children playing barefoot, and vendors calling out in a cheerful mix of English and Tagalog. Nothing about the scene resembled the academic world he came from, yet it pulsed with a kind of vitality he couldn't define. Inside the school, the air was hot, fans spinning lazily. The principal greeted him warmly and led him to a modest auditorium where students had prepared a small program. Hawthorne sat in the front row, unsure of what to expect. It began with a boy reciting Shakespeare, not with the crisp perfection of a British actor, but with conviction that made the words feel newly alive. Next, a group of girls presented a debate about climate change, their arguments sharp, passionate, laced with humor. Then a shy 12-year-old girl stepped up to the microphone. Her voice trembled at first, but her English was clear and firm. "My parents work overseas," she began. "They clean buildings in other countries. But they always tell me, your voice will take you further than we ever could. I want to be a lawyer, to defend people like them. That's why I speak English, because my voice matters." She paused, looking straight at him, not with anger, but with quiet defiance. Something in Hawthorne's chest cracked open. All his theories, all his carefully built hierarchies of language and culture, suddenly felt meaningless. He stood up slowly, his throat tight. "I came here believing language was a ladder," he said softly. "Now I see. It's a bridge." The students watched him in silence. English belongs to those who use it to tell the truth, to build hope. And today, you've done that better than anyone I've ever met. The room erupted in applause. The girl smiled. For the first time in decades, Hawthorne didn't feel like a professor or a judge of words. He felt like a student again, one who had finally understood what language was truly for. Weeks later, winter wrapped Boston in quiet snow. Back at Harvard, the campus felt both familiar and foreign, as if the air itself carried a question he could no longer ignore. Hawthorne walked through the yard, past statues of scholars who once defined his every belief, and realized how hollow their certainty now seemed. The university had invited him to deliver a keynote lecture, the same prestigious event that had celebrated his theories for decades. This time, though, his notes were blank. On the morning of the lecture, he stood backstage staring at the packed auditorium. Cameras waited, students buzzed, colleagues whispered. He took a deep breath and stepped into the light. For most of my career, he began, I taught that English was the property of its origin. The West, the elite, the educated. I thought correctness meant ownership. His voice trembled slightly. But I was wrong. He spoke of the Philippines, the taxi driver with humor sharper than wit, the students who quoted Shakespeare with their own rhythm, the girl whose essay shattered his arrogance. In Manila, he said, I saw English not as perfection, but as purpose, not as imitation, but as identity. The room was still. Some of his peers looked uneasy. Others leaned forward, listening as if hearing him for the first time. The most authentic English I've ever heard, he continued, was spoken not in this hall, but in classrooms with broken chairs and boundless hope. A pause, the only sound was the hum of the microphone. Then a slow clap from the back of the room. Another joined, and another. Within seconds, the hall erupted in applause. Not the polite kind reserved for professors, but a roar of genuine admiration. That night, headlines spread across the world. Harvard professor admits he was wrong. Honors Filipino English. But for Hawthorne, the real moment wasn't the applause or the press. It was the quiet after the speech, when he realized humility could speak louder than authority. News of Hawthorne's speech spread faster than he could have imagined. Within days, video clips circulated across social media, translated into dozens of languages. Filipinos shared it with pride, their captions filled with joy, vindication, and love for their culture. Finally, one post read, "Someone listened." Back in Manila, the students from that small public school gathered in their classroom, watching the professor's confession on an old television. When he said, "English belongs to those who give it meaning," the girl who once read My Voice Matters smiled quietly. For her, it wasn't just about language anymore. It was about dignity. Hawthorne, meanwhile, began writing a book titled The Living Tongue, Lessons from the Philippines. It wasn't an academic paper or a defensive theory. It was an apology disguised as gratitude, a reflection on how a language survives not through rules, but through the people who keep it alive. The preface began simply, "I went to teach. Instead, I was taught what humanity sounds like." His story sparked a global conversation about linguistic diversity. Universities began to reconsider how they defined proper English. Educators debated the line between grammar and identity. For the first time in his life, Hawthorne found himself not leading a discussion, but joining one. He received letters from teachers around the world, thanking him for his honesty. Some were from students who had been mocked for their accents, others from scholars who had silently doubted the very hierarchies he once enforced. Each letter carried the same message. Thank you for proving that voice is power. Standing once again at his Harvard office window, watching the snow fall outside, Hawthorne whispered, "It's not about who owns English, it's about who lives it." And somewhere, half a world away, the hum of Manila answered back. Not in perfect grammar, but in perfect truth. Years later, when people spoke of Elias Hawthorne, they no longer mentioned his awards, his theories, or the papers he once wrote about linguistic purity. They spoke of the man who changed his mind, and in doing so, gave others permission to believe in their own voices. In Manila, English was still spoken in taxis, classrooms, markets, and churches. It wasn't flawless, it wasn't textbook, but it was alive, full of humor, struggle, and hope. It carried the rhythm of a people who had learned to make language their own, and that Hawthorne realized was perfection of a different kind. In his final lecture, Years after the moment that changed him, he told his students, "Language isn't born from power. It's born from need, from love, from survival, and it grows wherever someone dares to speak." He paused, smiling faintly. "If you want to find the soul of a language, listen, not to the loudest voice, but to the truest one." He closed his notes, walked outside, and let the cold air fill his lungs. Snow drifted down over Harvard Yard, soft and unhurried. Somewhere inside, he carried the warmth of another world, of Manila sunlight, laughter, and voices that once taught him what humility sounds like. Because in the end, language was never about who spoke it best. It was about who spoke it with heart.